Well, my family moved into this general neighborhood in 1924 when I was 5 years old, and we lived about 3 blocks from where Metropolitan Market is now, and so that was the dominant thing in our neighborhood. Is that corner happened to have a fuel delivery facility there where steam-driven trains would come in and unload their coal in slabs of wood, and then that was distributed to the few houses that were out in here. But this was very close to virgin territory. It had been logged. The big trees had been taken out, but the stumps were all through these hills here. There were a couple of 5-acre farms, but there were essentially no houses in View Ridge. There were no houses in Hawthorne Hills. So Sandpoint Naval Station in those early days was out in the country. It was way out, and it was only serviced by gravel roads, dirt roads at that time. So it was a good place to grow up, cruise around, but the neighborhoods had not developed. What is now the Gilman Trail was a railroad line, and it was active, and steam-driven trains were frequently on that line, and it didn't become a trail until many, many years later. My first recollection of the naval base was in about 1924, and my family during the summer put up a tent at Pontiac Bay, which is an integral part of the base today, and we went camping down there. And there was very, very little on the base at that time, and there was a aggregation of buoys that were anchored to the lake floor by a chain, and at the top of the chain was a steel ball, and on top of that was a loop, so that amphibious aircraft or seaplanes could tie up to those, and then the crews would be transported on a small boat to shore. But there was no runway there as such. Again, the naval station, as I remember, was just logged off land and a little lake, and there was just nobody lived around it. It was just really out in the country. It was way out. There was a little colony of Japanese farmers that were quite close to what became the naval station. And they generally raised vegetables, which they sold at the Pike Street Market. And these 4 Japanese families were relocated sometime after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese of the Northwest were moved far inland to get them away from the coast. And that is a story of itself, of course. But there was a Heath family that contacted a pioneer family by the name of Denny. And they had a beach. June through September, people could drive down there and pay about 10 cents per person and enjoy a beach. And the beach was dominated by a World War I wooden ship that had been grounded, and on the superstructure of the ship they had a drag line. And what they did was remove gravel from the beach and put it in barges, and the barges were then carried down to Seattle, where they're putting up the Pioneer building. The new buildings were being serviced for gravel by these barges from Sandpoint. But it was a real lucrative gravel bed, and these barges would see the canal itself opened in 1917. Now you could take a barge down through the waterways through Ballard, out through the government locks, and thence to wherever the building sites were. So it was an active business. But that wore out, and this barge then became, or this old World War II ship then became the featured item at this beach, because with this arm over the water, they had a cable that went from the end of the boom, and you could, and it was a big ship, so if you could and you could climb a ladder up the side of the ship and onto a platform, grab a cable that had a stick in it, and you go swinging out over the water, over the gravel, then back again, and you get about 2 good swings, then you let go. See, well, this was a Seattle's modern beach. Yeah, so. There was a man by the name of Charles Lindbergh that flew the Atlantic in 1927 to Paris, the Lone Eagle. Right. And the Lone Eagle put his airplane on a ship and brought it back to the States, and he visited about 8 major U.S. cities, and Seattle was one of them. And they made a little runway parallel to Sandpoint Way, and I was down there as an 8-year-old in 1927 when Lindbergh flew in. I didn't get a chance to meet him, but I got as close as I could get. But he had wheels on this aircraft, and so he landed on the ground. Yeah. But these boys I described earlier had been out there, and I had the impression that naval aircraft on the West Coast, amphibious type, or flying, what they called flying boats, would come in and they would visit Sandpoint, perhaps on the way to Alaska. I'm not clear on that, but anyway, they were seaplanes, so they would be on a buoy while they were here. Somewhat earlier, I believe in 1923, the U.S. Army sponsored a trip around the world that originated at Sandpoint. I wasn't aware of this as a child, because then I'd be 4 years old at that time. So, but anyway, there's a monument in front of Sandpoint to this day commemorating the departure of the Army airplanes that were on floats, and they took off for a east to west trip around the world that took something like, I believe, 3 months or so, or maybe longer than that. And they had a number of aircraft that made it, and a couple that didn't make it. So it was rather a long trek, but they went up through Alaska and probably into Siberia and down into Japan and made their way along. Somewhere about the 1934-35, a building project was initiated, and the WPA put up brick buildings in a row parallel to Sandpoint Way, and they built using brick. They built an administrative, or the commander's complex, at what is now the main entrance to this station. But and they included the officers' club and some transient officers' quarters. But there were just a cluster of brick buildings that were built by WPA labor. And the WPA and the CCCs were part of Franklin Roosevelt's program to get our country rolling again, because we were in a very, very deep depression. And there was a lot of poor people around, a lot of hardships. And the so-called safety net had not been initiated then. So about the time they were building Grand Coulee Dam as part of the program, they were setting up the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they were organizing the WPA, and they engaged massive numbers of boys and men and gave them jobs. And that sort of turned the country around. But the early 1930s was about the depth of the Great Depression. But you can see the revival of the economy by just watching what was going on at Sandpoint. I don't have any remembrances of their building a runway. I lived in this neighborhood from 1924 to 1934, at which time I was in Roosevelt High School, and the family moved to the University District. But the vast construction of Sandpoint, as we saw it develop, was done in the late 1930s. And as the 1930s terminated, well, I myself went on active duty with the Army, so I was gone for 28 years on other activities. So, but when I came back to Seattle, of course, Sandpoint itself had developed into a rather extensive modern naval station, complete with runways and ramps and taxiways and that sort of thing. Well, I had when I was about 12 years old, I had a paper route, and it was for the Seattle Star, which was a Scripps Howard paper, long defunct. But I had all of the customers from what's now Lower Laurelhurst all the way out to the CCC camp. There was one incident that I've always been willing to relate, because it kind of identified the times. My last stop was at the CCC camp, and one of these lads one of these men who were my customers asked me if I was hungry. And of course, at my age, you're hungry all the time, perpetually hungry. So I said, sure. So we marched into the mess hall. It's typical World War II accommodations, which were picnic benches with rough lumber tables, you see. And we sat down, and the Army cooks presented me with a meal I'd never seen in my life. We had shrimp and steak, and I thought, boy, this is great. What a paper route. What a joy this paper route is. Well, the next time I did that, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I was about halfway through my meal. And I looked around, here's a second lieutenant there. He said, son, finish your meal, but this is your last one.